and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome everybody to this wonderful event, which to my mind, we should describe as an academics party. This is where we celebrate Professor Deana Heath's really, I was about to say beautiful book. It is beautiful in its analytical capacity. However, it's not necessarily a happy book, and therefore perhaps that adjective is misplaced. But we are going to discuss Colonial Terror, Torture and State Violence in Colonial India, which was published last year. Professor Deana Heath herself is chair in Indian and colonial history at the University of Liverpool. And this is her second monograph. The first one was about obscenity and its policing. It was called Purifying Empire, Obscenity and the Politics of Moral Regulation in Britain, India, and Australia. She's also published a co-edited book on South Asian governmentalities, continuing with her interest and her application of Foucauldian paradigms. This one has the subtitle Michel Foucault and the Question of Post-Colonial Orderings. Professor Heath has been prolific, and I think it will be less productive for me to go through all of her excellent publications and rather keep the focus on the publication that we are here to celebrate today. Okay, along with Professor Heath, we have Dr. Radha Kumar, who is associate professor. I may have just been very rude. I think in the US context, I should have said Professor Radha Kumar, I do apologize, who is associate professor in the history department in Syracuse University, and she's also senior research associate of the South Asia Center. Of course, Professor Kumar is herself a really acclaimed published author, also on the topic of colonial violence and policing, and her book, Police Matters, the Everyday State and Caste Politics in South India, 1900 to 1975, is very germane to this discussion. So we are really fortunate to have Professor Kumar with us today. We also have with us Dr. Mayur Suresh, and once again, pointing to titles, this is just the UK convention. That would be professor, I believe, in the US. Dr. Suresh is lecturer in law at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where he joined as lecturer in September 2015. His publications are many and address the two themes that have motivated his research. To me, it seems in terms of the empirical content, one is about anti-terror laws and the kind of policing and adjudication that allows a kind of systemic legalized violence on the one hand, and on the other hand, his engagement in LGBTQ+ activism and in recording the legal history of such in recent times. He uses methodologies which are derived from law and anthropology, and of course, legal theories related to emergency legality. So we have an excellent theme here today. I myself am Nandini Chatterjee. I am professor of South Asian history at the University of Exeter. I am a kind of imposter legal historian. Unlike Mayur, I've never had any training in law. I just taught myself some stuff as I went along. And recently I wrote a book on Mughal history, which is early modern, of course, not your periods at all, but it won a prize in legal history. So I think I've warned at least some people. So on that basis, I think we have an excellent combination of a trickster as well as some serious academics. And I give the floor back to Deana to introduce her own. Thank you so much. I'm very sorry, I am making mistakes today. I should also introduce the series of which this is a part. Susan Little is with us, and she's one of the coordinators of the Perpetrator Studies network, which has a particular series called the New Books in Perpetrator Studies, and it introduces recent publications in the field in conversation with researchers, especially from other disciplines. So it's definitely meant for interdisciplinary conversations, and the aim is to foster dialogue across disciplines and to engage critically with the concept of perpetrator and perpetration. So very pleased and sorry for all the stumbles, but hopefully the party will be great. Back to you, Deana.
Thank you, Nandini. And yes, I'd like to extend thanks to Suzanne for inviting me to do what really is a second launch for me. So this feels a bit like a cheat because the book first came out in March last year in a UK edition, and then I had a launch in July. But two things that seemed legitimate to me to have another party, as Nandini puts it. We really should, follow Downing Street guidelines, I think, and just get drunk out of our minds and start puking at 4 a.m. Follow our esteemed Prime Minister and his cabinet. What seemed to me to legitimate doing this again is that actually a US edition then came out last summer and a South Asian edition in November. So like editions of the book have been staggering out across the past year. And so that seemed to merit a further look, I thought. And also the fact that it's the Perpetrator Studies Network. And for me, thinking about perpetrators was a key aspect of this project, and in fact writing about perpetrators in a way I think they haven't been written about before in colonial context, certainly not in the case of India. So I'll say a few words about perpetrators when I talk about the book. So to do that, I'm going to hold on a sec, share my and now my computer is doing exactly what I had feared it would do. It's messing up on me. Let's see if it's going to cooperate. When I go to do something, it just does crazy, weird things. Okay, so far this looks so good, doesn't it? Okay, hopefully it will cooperate with me. Okay, so in talking about this book, what I'd like to do is start by talking about the genesis of it, because it actually began not with questions about colonial violence, but about the nature of the colonial archive, specifically the National Archives of India in New Delhi, because it was there that I first encountered the word torture in the large bound indexes produced by the British for their many archival series, legislative, judicial, police, etc. One of the advantages I find in working in the National Archives of India, it does sort of have a search engine now, but it's not that reliable. And so, scholars end up going back to the original colonial indexes in these massive books. And I find it's useful to do that to sort of get a panoptical view of the system of governments for each different legislative department. And it was in the course of doing that that I came across repeatedly in these indexes the word torture. And this struck me for a lot of reasons. What the hell was this word doing in there? Because colonial regimes have little interest in the welfare of colonized peoples, particularly in regard to the violence they inflict on each other. And as I talk about in the book, the actual torture itself was inflicted by Indians on Indians. So why, I wondered, would the British colonial regime in India have been monitoring issues to do with torture? What purpose, in addition, did the concept of torture serve for such a regime? Why, furthermore, did torture appear to be such a persistent problem for the colonial regime? Because the term, as I went on to discover, appeared in colonial indexes and other documents with surprising regularity from the early 19th century onwards. And why, moreover, had torture in colonial India attracted so little attention from scholars, barring largely a small body of work on the 1854 Madras Torture Commission, which doesn't really question why on earth a colonial regime would do something so astonishing as to set up a commission to examine its own violence and rapacity. And what finally did colonial torture reveal about the nature of colonial violence more generally? So these were the questions that I set out to answer, and I have to confess, it took me a hell of a long time to answer them. In part because they required an interrogation of scholarship from a wide range of disciplines on issues to do with things like violence, the archive, policing, law, the state, sovereignty, terror, pain, suffering, and trauma, gendered violence, and of course, torture. A bigger challenge, though, was figuring out how to theorize torture in colonial India, particularly since I sought to understand torture as part of the broader repertoire of colonial violence. The task I set myself then was the rather modest, but to me important one, which is why I devoted a whole chapter of the book to it, of attempting to theorize the nature and operation of colonial violence. So to turn to how I answered these questions in the book, I'll start with those in relation to the British colonial regime's monitoring of torture in India, what purpose the concept of torture served, and why it was a persistent problem for the British. The answer to all of these can be summed up, I think, by Robert Young's, there we go, definition of colonial torture, which is, no, I've done it. There we go. It's my computer just doing crazy things. Sorry about this. I'm just not going to mess with it and just leave it there. So Young's definition of torture, which is the violence of the state secreted out of sight, which it claims not to authorize in order to exercise its power over the bodies of its subjects and the space of its occupied territory. In other words, there was nothing remotely exceptional or aberrational about torture in colonial India. It was instead a quotidian aspect of the structural violence of the colonial state. But as it was impossible for such a state to acknowledge the constitutive role of such violence to the maintenance of its rule, it had to repeatedly deny its culpability for systemic torture and make endless attempts to appear to eradicate it by displacing the blame for it onto what I have termed, drawing upon a study of policing in Brazil by Martha Huggins, Mika Haritos Faturas, and Philip Zimbardo, as its violence workers, namely the subordinate members of its police forces. Central to colonial terror, therefore, is a rethinking of the nature of policing in colonial India. And I just put some quotes here from various sources in colonial India that kind of hit home the purpose of the Indian police, the colonial police, and how they were perceived. So they were essentially an organization designed to perpetuate Britain's occupation of India. And as such, their role was to keep the Indian populace in a state of terror. And so there's a lot of description of the Indian police from really the mid-19th century onwards as being a terror to young and old alike, and as an engine of oppression of the most exquisite and pernicious kind. And really beginning more so from the early 20th century, critiques of the police as being responsible for transforming India into the policeman's kingdom, or what some critics called a police state. For the British, however, it was the uncivilized, atavistic nature of the Indian police, as they saw it, that was responsible for systemic torture in colonial India, not their system of rule. Such a narrative, while incredibly enduring, began to buckle by the early 20th century in the face of the first major torture scandal since the Torture Commission, which was spurred by British repression of the Indian nationalist movement. And in response to this, the British strove to make torture in colonial India simply disappear by renaming it mistreatment. And so it's from this point onwards that the word torture just vanishes from colonial records. Reappears again in the 1940s, but briefly. As to why torture in colonial India, or indeed in other colonial contexts, has attracted so little attention from scholars, barring as a means of, as the colonizers put it, counterinsurgency, a term I greatly dislike because it legitimates the colonial violence against colonized peoples. This is because I think we still view colonialism in contexts such as India in many ways far too benignly. which is a product in part of the way in which violence continues to be understood, namely as an act committed by identifiable individuals against other identifiable individuals. This form of violence, which Slavoj Žižek terms objective violence, is the most visible form of violence, which explains why when scholars study colonial violence, they tend to focus on events like genocides and massacres. But as Žižek also notes, such forms of violence are only the visible manifestations of other forms, such as structural or symbolic violence. So it is such forms of violence that we need to study in order to make sense of the nature of colonial violence. So it was to challenge conceptions of British rule in India as being relatively benign that I organized the chapters of Colonial Terror according to the ways in which torture was facilitated and perpetrated. I focus in chapters 2 and 3, for example, on what I term the facilitators of such torture, which included the colonial bureaucracy, the system of policing, the judiciary, and the colonial legal system, not to mention the Indian and British governments, as well as what scholars have termed bystander communities, such as the non-official British community in India and the press in Britain. I pay particular attention in chapter 3 to the ways in which the colonial legal system not only tolerated, but in fact relied on extra-legal violence, or to draw from Walter Benjamin, law-preserving violence carried out by the Indian police. My aim in doing so is in part to debunk the persistent myth that British colonialism in India operated through a rule of law. I refrain furthermore from focusing on the actual perpetrators of torture, who were largely from the lowest ranks of the Indian police until the final chapter of the book, in order to hit home the fact that torturers are made, not born. And in colonial India, systematized torture in the system of policing was only possible because of the ways in which it was enabled by the colonial state. I go further, in fact, to portray such perpetrators who were largely marginal because of their religious and/or caste and class status, as being themselves victims of the structural violence of colonial rule, not least through being employed on starvation wages in appalling working conditions. So one aim of the book, as I mentioned at the beginning, is to broaden the focus of scholarship that seeks to complicate conceptual categories of victims and perpetrators to include colonialism, in order to go beyond, in other words, perceptions of victimhood as being invested in the vulnerability and integrity of a human being, and those of perpetrators being steeped in notions about the extraordinariness of evil, of those who are beyond or outside humanity. I endeavor, in addition, to disrupt the gendered nature of the victim-perpetrator binary, in which women are inherent victims and men intrinsic perpetrators, not least through delineating the nature of police torture in colonial India, which invariably involves sexual violence against both men and women. As I've written about elsewhere, violated Indian male bodies, in fact, litter the colonial archive. Now, in terms to conclude as to what colonial torture reveals about the nature of colonial violence, I won't torture all of you here by going into depth about my theoretical arguments. I tortured myself with that for about a decade, which draw heavily upon Giorgio Agamben's work on states of exception and Michel Foucault's on governmentality. Apart from saying that I argue we should view the British colonial state in India as what I term a regime of exception, in which two levels of extraordinarity coexisted. And I, in fact, borrowed this term from Santanu Kanika's, or this concept from Santanu Kanika's wonderful book on state violence in post-colonial India, entitled State Violence and Legitimacy in India. Now, one level of what I call this regime of exception then was a state or spaces of exception wrought by widespread emergency regulations. And the other, what Didier Fassin terms petty states of exception, generated by colonial officials like the police, acting as petty sovereigns. And it was such a regime, the book argues, that generated the conditions in which not only torture, other forms of violence could flourish. And I'll stop there.
Thank you for that very evocative introduction of your book, Deana. You really opened up not only the contents of the book, and I am grateful to you that you actually tread the line between describing what is actually extreme viciousness on the one hand, and talking of and not luring the reader and in fact listener to a form of voyeurism. It is a hard act. And I think because one of your projects is to expose the persistent and normalized violence that the structure itself entails. I think the microhistories that microhistory is methodologically wrong here, but the vignettes you actually produce in your book are in fact viscerally disturbing. But the way you do it and the way you did it in your introduction itself, which is leading by the theory, I actually found both accessible and really ethical as well. But that's just me. Why don't I actually pass on to Professor Radha Kumar, who herself has written about everyday violence and by the state and the social hierarchies by which that was sustained. I'm very curious, Radha, how does that sound to you?
Thank you so much, Nandini. And thank you, Deana and the Perpetrator Studies Center for inviting me here today to comment on this really wonderful book on torture in colonial India. And like Nandini said earlier, it's hard to use an adjective for this book given the topic, but it was really a wonderful book. In this book, Deana Heath looks at different aspects of torture, the system of state violence that it is part of, and the perpetrators themselves, to argue for its functioning as a specifically colonial form of state terror across 2 centuries of British rule in India. Although, as she indicates in the opening pages, this was of course true of other British colonies as well, including Kenya, infamously. Before I actually get into discussing substantive details of the book, I want to congratulate Deana for retaining the human or inhuman aspect of the story quite movingly. And I know Nandini also commented on the same aspect of it. Its rigorous focus on empirical and theoretical aspects of state violence notwithstanding. And again, I can only repeat what you said, Nandini, that this is a terrific balancing act to keep that going. The other thing I applaud is, it seems minor maybe, but I was really impressed by it, is the careful attention paid to transformations from the pre-colonial era to 18th century company rule. You know, across the book, the author examines judicial and revenue practices in the Mughal world to understand how things changed with the coming of the British. And this is especially impressive in a book that already straddles a long century, but it is essential to avoid romanticizing the pre-colonial past. And so it's an important aspect of the book. But now I'll actually get into talking about torture and state violence itself. And the first theme that I want to discuss is the non-binary exception and its relationship to law and state violence. Torture, Heath writes, is the quintessential act of exception. However, this does not mean that torture was an exceptional occurrence in the sense that of being a rare or occasional occurrence. Instead, the book shows that exception was normalized, even normativized under colonial rule, manifest as the institutionalization of torture. And this is actually one thing I'd love to hear more about, which is there are 2 ways we understand the word norm. Norm as the most common practice versus norm as the ideal practice. And when we use the term normalizing torture, which is actually the verb I've often used, it seems to me that what I'm suggesting there is that torture was common practice. Whereas what Deana uses is normativizing torture. And there's almost a suggestion that torture is a desired practice. And that's quite an important distinction, and I think important in the context of this book. Related to this, he disentangles exception from scandal, which is how torture was represented in colonial discourse. And this is another key intervention. because colonial discourse, when it could not deny the practice of torture, represented it as scandal rather than the normal occurrence of exception. And in contrast to exception, which is inextricably linked to the law, scandal could be more easily erased through the institution of a commission whose findings usually absolve the state of the violence it had committed. As Heath points out, a commission is by definition an emergency apparatus of the government disconnected from any of its branches. And so having a commission to investigate either one instance of torture, as after the Midnapore conspiracy trial in 1908, or even investigate torture, the systematic practice of torture, like in 1855 in the Madras presidency, did not directly impinge on the exercise of state power. Rather, these commission's findings allowed the continuation of the practice without any systemic change. But that's also only partly true when we take into consideration the court of public opinion. And that is somewhat different from judicial exoneration of torture. As he points out, the Midnapore case, occurring as it did in the early 20th century, when the anti-colonial nationalist movement had picked up considerable momentum, was, and I quote here, a fiasco from the reputational point of view. But even so, what ensued was not the end of torture, but instead the enactment of a surfeit of legislations that collectively dramatically reduced the political rights of Indian subjects. And so what happens with regard to the practice of state torture against dissidents in the ensuing decade is that these legislations allowed the colonial judiciary to now accept confessions without worrying about their disqualification on grounds that they could have been acquired through coercion. And this is quite a fascinating shift that I actually think possibly merits a whole other book, the new life of torture in the law in this era from the 1920s onwards. And especially given its current echoes in post-colonial India, the post-colonial present, I think that seems to be very relevant when we again have a surfeit of exceptional legislation. But coming back to the period up to the early 20th century, which is in many ways the book's focus, how did torture get institutionalized? And this brings me to a second fascinating broad theme in the book, which is the intersection of governmentality and discipline to professionalize violence, the use of sovereignty as a tactic of governmentality, and the use of torture as collective disciplining of a subject population. And this is a really important intervention because it brings the colonial context front and center in Foucauldian delineations of power, because here disciplinary power does not gradually replace sovereignty, nor even coexist with it, but instead works through it. So here what you have is punitive power as violence on the body, but in a carceral society. So that's really, the professionalizing of violence through violence workers. And it's the theoretical nuance here is really impressive. It's also impressive because it brings us directly to questions of agency, because we're talking about a system where power worked through the exercise of dehumanizing physical violence by Indian men on other marginalized Indian colonized subjects. And so Deana asks, how does an ordinary peasant man become a torturer? And this is a remarkably hard question, which the book addresses by drawing attention to individual, group, and cultural factors that created a condition where Indian subalterns tortured other Indian subalterns. And especially important here was the debilitating poverty and hunger caused by famines and a high tax burden, exacerbated by poor pay for police personnel, which was apparently often lower than the going rate for unskilled wage earners, all the while carrying the burden of being the state's violence workers. And I do want to emphasize here, again, the balancing act, which is that the book raises the question of agency while unambiguously challenging colonial displacement of the burden of torture onto native shoulders as a cultural artifact. It was instead a historical creation under colonial rule. If I have time, I'll move on to a couple of questions now. And the first is not perhaps particularly theoretical, but I would love it if you could talk a little bit more about this really stunning cover art. The colors are beautiful, but I also was struck by the juxtaposition between colonial state violence within the book and violence in indigenous art on the cover. And I was wondering, why you chose this, if you had anything to say about this. The title is interesting. It's called The Kingdom of Death, but then there are these chains, and, I struggle to interpret it. Where I reached was, can you think of this as the incursion of state violence into indigenous lives, which ultimately cannot be autonomous of the institutions of modern power? But I would love to hear what led you to choose this particular image. Now moving into the contents of the book itself, the section on the training and educational qualifications required for ICS officers was eye-opening, jaw-dropping for me. And to those who in the audience who may not yet have had a chance to read the book, I should mention that ICS officers were members of the Indian Civil Service. This was famously the steel frame of the Raj, the absolute elite who held considerable executive and judicial authority. And he points out that the legal and cultural training required for ICS officers, who were inevitably European, was shockingly low. And here, building from that, I was wondering about a couple of things. One is issues of race and class. How do we think of the remaking of race in the assumption that the average Englishman was inherently capable of ruling over hundreds of thousands of natives? And how do we think of the workings of class within Britain in the privileging of gentlemanly general knowledge over technical expertise? Related here is the broader theme of policing the police that runs across the literature. And you mentioned that it was impossible to have adequate supervision for the constabulary, given the pyramidal, racially organized structure of the force. But I'm wondering what the very discourse of reliance on supervision means to our understanding of power, since this is a spatial organization that is not panoptic, right? It is one that will always be limited by that pyramidal structure. It is one that does not then push for discipline as a form of power, but sovereign violence upon others as a form of power. And I was wondering how we can think about a structure of supervision in policing the police versus a panoptic way of policing the police. And finally, again, broader questions of post-colonial shadows, continuities, if you have any thoughts on that, but I'll stop for now and turn the mic back to Nandini. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Radha, for such a beautiful set of structured questions. It's really very easy to segue from what you were saying, especially your third question about policing the police. And it made me think straight away, of course, about the work that Mayur has been doing, a part of the work that Mayur has been doing in relation to the UAPA. And that's the anti-terrorism laws of India, and his analysis of the impunity of police in these contexts, and the refusal of the highest judicial organizations to respond to petitioners who have critiqued this impunity. I do also have questions, as all of us do, about the post-colonial context, because I think this is the beauty and strength of Deana's book, that it makes us think it's not just about the context that she writes about. It seems much more universal in its explanatory capacity. But why don't I actually turn over to the scholar who actually does write about the post-colonial context, Dr. Suresh?
Thank you, Nandini, and I hope I fulfill everything that that all the aspirations you have for my presentation. But thank you, and it's also Radha's presentation is a difficult act to follow. I'll try my best. But thank you most of all to Deana and the Perpetrator Studies Network for giving me the opportunity to read Colonial Terror, to engage with it. It's quite eye-opening. The detail, the vivid nature of it it's quite moving actually in some parts. And at some parts I had to put the book away for a bit, well, close my laptop for a bit, and then take a breath and then come back to it, because some of the descriptions are just so horrific. But yeah, so thank you to Deana, and thank you to the Perpetrator Studies Network. But the book is also super powerful when it comes to its theorizing. And it's, like I said before, it's only added to by the book's vivid and really moving imagery. And so much so that I found myself overwhelmed into different ways in which I could enter the ideas of this book. One idea that comes across very strongly is the performative element of statehood that's detailed in this book, or to use another anthropologist phrase, the performance of stateliness, of how the authority of the state was remade in effacing torture and responding to the scandal that torture presented it. And perhaps because of its very atmospheric descriptions, while reading the work, I was constantly reminded of these different movies that touched upon cinematic representations of police violence in India. One was, for example, Jai Bhim, the Tamil movie where custodial torture and death are intertwined with issues of caste identity, the need for confession, local hierarchy, local politics, the policeman's very, very, very mundane desire for promotion, and where ultimately, like the book itself, the authority of the law is remade. Or a slightly older movie, Ab Tak Chappan, where the violence is so quotidian and barely separate from the sphere of the police's domestic lives, and where the necessity of violence to the working of the law is dealt with. Or another movie, Maqbool, which I resaw recently, where there's a great difficulty in parsing legal and illegal violence, where questions of whether the police are perpetrator or victim are asked, and where violence remains an indelible stain on authority. So that's one way I could have done it. But as an ethnographer of law, I ultimately chose to go in a different direction. And I just want to briefly narrate the story of a man I came across during my fieldwork, who I'm still in touch with, and I call him Imran. And I think this kind of helps us think about ways in which the various theoretical strands can come alive in different milieus. So I met Imran, like I said, between 2010 and 2012 is when I came to know him very well. But his story is this, that in the late 1990s, Imran, he was a resident of Old Delhi, and he and his mother went to visit relatives who had left during partition in Lahore. A few weeks after his return, according to Imran, he was kidnapped. He was kidnapped by some people who he later came to know as members of the Special Cell. The Special Cell is a branch of the Delhi police which prosecutes anti-terrorism crimes. Imran told me that a friend of his witnessed the kidnapping, and at that time he was just about 18. And he was walking with a friend. The friend said that he was pushed into a white van with no windows. The friend didn't know if there was a license plate or not. Imran said they drove for a couple of hours, after which the van was stopped. In the van, he was hooded. He was kicked. He was told to keep quiet. And then once the van stopped, he was led down a series of steps. He was pushed onto the ground. Once one of the men removed the hood from him, he saw that he was in a room with very high ceilings that had windows at the top of the walls, almost like exhaust windows that had been covered over with newspapers. And in the dim light, he saw that he was surrounded by about half a dozen men. Over the next couple of weeks, he's not exactly sure how long, Imran was tortured. He was beaten, and the men there told him that they would rape his mother and sister. He was strung from the ceiling in what the men referred to as the aeroplane. He was forced into stress positions, one of which he says nearly dislocated his knee. All this time, as he was being tortured, he's kept on asking the men why he was being tortured, why they were inflicting such, in his words, atrocities upon him, zulm. And the men mentioned something about bombs, and he told them that he was the main perpetrator. This led to Imran suspecting that the men were actually police officials, though he couldn't confirm it until sometime later, about a month after he was kidnapped, when he was finally taken before a magistrate. And then he saw several people from that room now in khaki uniform. The men threatened him, saying that if he spoke to the judge, he would never be let go. After a super perfunctory hearing, which Imran says lasted all of 30 seconds, he was sent to the police. He was sent to police custody and remained there for more than a month. In that police station, he was subject to, in his words, a very different type of torture. He was told that he was accused of planting a series of bombs in Delhi and other cities in North India. When I heard this, he said, his head started spinning. The police officers, through a mixture of threats and further detention and some beating, and enticements of early release and permission to see his family, forced him to sign several confessions, or 161 statements as are known in legal parlance. After his period of police custody, he was remanded to judicial custody, where he stayed for the next 14 years as his case ground to the courts. During this time, his father died, his mother had a stroke, his family was economically devastated as they had to sell property to pay for the lawyers. Classmates he started school with started their lives on their own. They had kids, they had careers. People died from his life. People came into the world from outside. People had children. People were married, while he was stuck in jail. And to use a very evocative phrase from the book, he was effectively unworlded from the world outside. Imran spent about 14 years in jail, after which he was finally acquitted. In a curious postscript, as I kind of made lists of the police officers involved in his case, I began Googling them to figure out if there was anything about them online. One of the search results pointed to a case that was listed on the legal search engine Indian Qanun. It was a case filed by one police official against the state. He had applied for a gallantry award, and these are awards given by the President of India for gallantry. But the application was turned down. And the gallantry award usually comes with a medal and an increment and some other monetary benefit, the cash prize. And since his application was turned down, he filed a case in the Central Administrative Tribunal challenging this decision. In his application, he had listed all the suspects that he had shot dead in support of his promotion. So everyone that he had shot dead while in investigating or dealing with terrorism cases, he listed all those people he had shot dead and said, I have shot this many people dead, I want a promotion on that basis. The tribunal ordered the state to reconsider his application. I'm not sure how it went after, but this kind of case kind of just boggles my mind, first of all. But also the question I have is, how do we understand the variety of violences, the varieties of violence that Imran faced? How do we understand his experience? What does it mean to kind of experience these different forms of law and legality? And how does this form of violence of shooting dead people and presumably torturing people become a line in a bureaucratic application relating to awards and increments? And I think Colonial Terror, the book, can help us understand these different aspects, to coin a phrase, of encounters with the police. The first is the book's steadfast refusal to bracket out torture as a specific type of violence. The book expands the horizon of torture beyond the physical act of torture and situates it in state structures, in law, and society. Torture does not occur despite the law or state structures or modes of supervision, but because of them. And kind of referring back to Radha's noticing of the difference between normalizing and normativizing is something almost to be desired. And the violence of colonial policing was far from exceptional, and took place because of the nature of the state and its attempt to enforce its rule upon society. From the extractive nature of colonial rule, commissions of inquiry, to the official functioning of judges, to the conditions of employment of police personnel, the book gives us, in really excruciating and somewhat exciting detail, the ways in which torture came to be embedded in the everyday experience of the state. The book also gives us a liminal concept, which I'll come to later on, about which I have some questions, of the regime of exception as a way of understanding violence that does not occur in the state of exception, but is simultaneously beyond what is ordinary. This kind of intermediary middle level, as the book tells us, was generated by petty sovereigns, who, through the enactment of illegal violence in the operation of law, created kind of minor states of exception. This second level encompassed both the suspension of the law and the legalization of exceptional measures, as the book tells us. Lastly, the book helps us reframe kind of contemporary popular debates as well, by looking at the police not as enforcers of the rule of law, but of agents of terror that are enmeshed in wider bureaucracies. This conceptual shift helps us understand how fear is at the heart of colonial state-making and perhaps present-day state-making, and the preservation of its rule. Though this is a work of history, as I gestured earlier, this book helps us understand the contemporary policing as well. It helps us understand how Imran's experience of terror extended beyond the torture chamber and into the courtroom. It helps us frame the uncertainty of that experience. It helps us understand police officers who decided to torture Imran as petty sovereigns, whose violence was subsequently authorized by a deliberate oversight by the presiding magistrate. It helps us understand the policeman's case before the administrative tribunal, that violence is imbricated in the most mundane bureaucratic operations of the state. Colonial terror helps us see how terror is endemic to policing. The book is wonderfully detailed and conceptually exciting. For footnote nerds like myself, it's an absolute gold mine. I do want to end with a question about one of the concepts offered by the book, and that's the idea of the regime of exception. It's a good way for me to understand violence that is not quite here, that is a rule of law, and simultaneously not quite there, that is a state of exception. And I'm immediately drawn to such an intermediary second level concept. And some of the things you hear, whether in academic or read in academic discourse or popular discourse, is stuff like exceptional legislation or extraordinary violence, which in Agamben's terms is a contradiction. But this kind of concept helps us kind of move it down from Agamben a bit. My question is, and I apologize in advance for going through this idea that's been kind of rattling around in my brain for a while now. I apologize during this book launch. And I've been thinking whether there's any need at all for the idea of normality and the state of exception. What is the conceptual duality or the conceptual triumvirate, as now with the regime of exception, with the regime of exception, do for us? If an experience of law simultaneously experience of violence, and the book cites many theorists to kind of buttress that point, I'm wondering what is there about the conception of what's there in the rule of law versus state of exception. What does it give us that just understanding, for example, an experience of terror does not, right? So I understand there are limits to skeptics of the state of exception framework, whether it's Nasser Hussain or in Gross, Fleur Johns, because they struggle to understand state violence that's beyond law. But if the experience of law and policing is itself terror, why do we need the state of exception at all? So if there's a category of exceptional legislation, my question is, where's the law and where's the exception? If there's a category of extraordinary violence, that calls into question what is ordinary violence. And I'm beginning to wonder whether Agamben and Schmidt, what they're actually articulating is some form of like state effect, right? And it's similar to the point that you make, that the book makes about torture, right? So that torture is something that enables the state to kind of reframe itself. And I wonder if the state of exception can be similarly stated, right? Where the dichotomy of the two, between the state of exception and the state of normality, is an effect of the everyday operation of the state, right? That only serves to re-enable our faith in this rule of law. And so that's my big question. And it's not a question particularly aimed at the book. I love the book, but it's just a question that I've been thinking about. And this book has provided a great way for me to pose it. So I'll end over there. And so thank you very much. I might have ended a bit early, but so sorry about that, but thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful set of comments, as well as the question that you end with, Mayur. I do think you go to the heart of the matter, really. And once Deana has had a bit of time to respond to both your comments and questions, I, in fact, have a plan to try and expand that even further and ask a question that I asked of Deana, and just to give her a bit of warning in advance, that I asked of her last year at the LSA Roundtable, the Law and Society Association Roundtable, as in where do we draw the line between police violence and other forms of violence. And just to give you a view of what it is that I was talking about, you'll probably recognize this image. It's an artist's version of Mohammad Zubair being beaten in the Delhi riots. I wonder if you can keep that in mind, in fact, where we draw the line between perpetration and perpetrators of one kind and another. But I won't distract you yet. Deana, would you like to start responding to some of Radha and Mayur's thoughts?
You've both given me a lot to think about, and I don't know if I can possibly answer. Yes, I know some of these are thoughts in progress, as Mayur mentioned, as things that you're wrestling with yourselves. I wanted to start by just commenting on a few things that you noted as you were talking. And I was grateful for Nandini at the beginning for saying that the book avoids voyeurism, because much of the time that I was working on this book, and one of my PhD students is here in the group today, will know this, that I run these reading groups and I've been exploring for years now issues to do with violence and how we represent it, violence against people of color, violence against people, who've marginal people, gender violence, all these things. And what does it mean to interrogate an archive? What's my position in all of this? So I torment myself, in fact, too much with these questions to the point that sometimes I feel they're crippling in terms of how I set about doing what I do. So it's interesting because when I first started approaching publishers with this book, I didn't get anywhere. And it had a completely different intro and a different conclusion. And in fact, the intro tied Colonial India to contemporary and recent events involving the perpetration of violence against people of color around the world by Western states and within those states, right? So publishers didn't seem to like this. And one of the critiques I got from one of the reviewers of the book was, where's all the torture? And I explicitly, I've got dozens and dozens of cases, right? I can do the torture, so to speak. Not doing the torture is an explicit choice. It only comes in when I'm trying to explain aspects of the violence I'm describing, the system I'm describing. So there's very much an attempt on my part not to be voyeuristic and not to be gratuitous in talking about torture, which to me, quite a bit of scholarship around torture can do. So so I just wanted to mention that Radha, absolutely there needs to be another book from the 20s. I felt that I could have gone on a lot more with that shift, and there wasn't room, and it's been an idea for, yeah, I might return to that issue there in particular. But all those cases in the early 20th century, the so-called conspiracy trials, it's fascinating how little attention has been paid to the way that in which they operated legally and what undid them, because actually most of them were undone. And it's actually because of the methods used by the Indian police and these structures that supported them. So there's actually an awful lot of interest to say there, I think. And also one of the things that blew my mind, I've never seen anybody write about this, from the early 20th century, you start to get civil cases being brought by victims of police torture. And in fact, the case that I mentioned at the end of the book, there's a civil case, and the material on it is hundreds of pages long, and they won. And they brought, in fact, there were multiple cases because the Bengal government kept fighting against them and losing. So there's so much to be said there about how this torture regime that I describe was challenged and then changed, because it didn't go away, right? And its targets changed and the nature of it changed, but it certainly didn't go away. The colonial regime got a lot more skilled in doing it, let's put it that way. Okay, so just a couple of other things. Films, oh my God, Mayur, we could be here until films, seriously. I actually teach a module on post-colonial India taught through cinema, you know, in which I explore a lot of the issues that fascinate me through films. And there's much to be derived from the way that that Indian cinema has for decades explored these kind of issues. So to me, I think they're very rich. At one point, I built I have about 800 Indian films, but at one point I built a whole collection on films involving the police and violence. I'm like, yes, it's going to be a crucial part. There's nowhere for that in this book, but I don't know, maybe it's there in the making. It's waiting for me to talk about that. So in response to your specific questions, can we start with the cover question, Radha? I want to share something with you. So I'm making a choice to show you this image again. You'll note there were no images in the book. Not entirely a conscious decision. I had actually selected a group of images that portrayed, really, I wanted to highlight the impoverishment of these men who were doing the tortures, the conditions in which they lived and worked. And yeah, that sort of thing mostly. And this book was a COVID book. And so if anybody tried to get anything out of the British Library over the course of 2 years, you'll know you couldn't. Their reprographic services completely shut down. So it just proved impossible to have any images in the book. Now I'm showing you this really problematic image because this was originally the book's cover. This is the only image I've ever found that depicts the torture and murder of a police suspect. This is actually from Burma in the 1880s by a very notorious photographer. Some of you may have heard of Willoughby Wallace Hooper, who did those famous famine photographs, the notorious famine that just depict, you know, absolutely emaciated famine victims in these staged photographs. He also went around documenting stuff like this for fun, apparently. So this was in a collection of his photographs in the British Library. And actually in the image, there were originally two men. They'd literally been strung up and crucified, as you can see. And there's two British officials, we can see members of the police just looking on with what looks like approval. Oh, this is all good, done and dusted. So a version of this was originally on the cover. And again, it was the reprographic problems at the British Library that prevented me from using it. In hindsight, I'm very glad I couldn't use it. I mean, I had wanted the tortured victim here obscured and so on, but there are so many problems when we're using images like this. So this doesn't appear anywhere in the book. I find, you know, the thought of recreating the violence that this scene describes is extremely disturbing to me. So that the cover that I ended up with was I don't have a cover because the British Library won't give me the image. And so searching for this, and I found that Santal scroll. So it's actually a scroll, a long scroll with all these images depicting the kingdom of death. I actually felt in the end that this worked better because I'm trying to encapsulate the complexities of this system here, right? Because I think historically this sort of violence in which you have native agents, so to speak, doing the violence on the bodies of other Indians is, again, how is this colonial violence? Oh, thank you, Nandini, for putting the cover up there. How is this colonial violence? And so, yeah, it's to zero in on that, the nature of that violence, but also this scene depicts the kingdom of hell. And it depicts these as, you know, it's part of this larger power in a sense, right, that's shaping and enabling this. But again, to make it usable, there was a lot of discussion with the team I was working with at Oxford to break this down into just these component parts. I didn't want again, that in your face, you know, because the figures are all black. They're meant to be these demonic figures. I didn't want that kind of, but just highlighting the acts, so to speak, pulling out these. So that's how I ended up with that cover. In terms of your question about issues to do with race and class, I may need to ask you to clarify that. So can you tell me again what you were asking? So issues to do with how, yeah, go on.
The idea that the European ICS officer doesn't need technical expertise or even legal training, but can rely on his gentlemanly general knowledge. You know, what does that mean about a man of a particular race and class being able to take decisions and sort of reproducing his position, his position.
This one is to me very ironic. I mean, one reason I spend so long in the book looking at the qualifications and the training of all these different figures in the system, judges and the higher ups in the police, the lower ranking members of the police, so on, is to get a sense of how that system worked, what sorts of knowledge was valued amongst whom, and all those sorts of things. I think that idea of the gentlemanly administrator, I mean, that's sort of carried down, hasn't it, in our understandings of colonial India, right? These, and I talk about that in the book, these sort of courageous, manly men, because they could go off and be in charge of districts of 4,000 miles over these, you know, brutal natives and that kind of sort of stuff. And all they had behind them was a proper education, and they knew how to ride a horse, right? I mean, the whole thing's absolutely ludicrous if it wasn't so awful, right? But I think one of the things I wanted to emphasize in the book is that is also called, to put it bluntly, bollocks, right? I mean, one of the things that I talk about, and scholars who've worked on colonial bureaucracy have talked about this, the myth of the ICS as being, you know, filled with these Etonian types who come from this grand lineage, and so they're just inherently gentlemanly, and that somehow qualifies them to lead over groups of people who are not deemed to be fully civilized. But that's all a myth, right? And so I look at in the book the lengths to which the policing service essentially had to go to get people to take up these jobs, particularly by the late 90s. Nobody wanted these jobs, right, from Britain. They were shitty, they were lousy pay, they were lousy options. And so the class dynamics actually started changing, right? And so from these military officers who were seen as the man, you get 19-year-olds with no, not even that sort of so-called gentlemanly ethos. So I think it reveals more about maintaining that facade. And I talk a lot in the book, the rule of law is a facade. It's a performance, right? And I think the British in their colonial endeavors relied so much on performance. You know, it's that ability to perform this role of this figure that was crucial, and that was seen as necessary to supervise thousands of officials potentially in each of these districts, or, you know, judges or whatever the case we're doing. And so that's why the only time torture became an issue in the lives of these men was if they were perceived in handling torture cases to not behave as a gentleman should, right? And it's the only time Europeans who did it ever had any comeuppance, because they undermined the perceptions that the British needed to uphold to maintain their authority in India, right? And it's that gentlemanly, civilized sort of demeanor, which none of them had anyway, but that was the kind of the myth. And that myth was incredibly powerful. So I don't know if that gets at what you're asking. I mean, I was thinking when you were talking about David Canadyne's book Ornamentalism, in which he talks about that race could trump, that class could trump race in the British Empire, right? And he says that, you know, certain elites from across the empire could bridge these racial barriers. I've always found that an interesting argument, and there's something in there to it. But I actually think nobody's looked at really the opposite of that, about the need to maintain that so-called racial prestige, that club that all of these indigenous elites around the empire would want to belong to, was actually really, really hard. And you can see just by studying the Indian police how much harder that became over time. And by the early 20th century, they've freaking practically given up because of the quality of the so-called recruits. In terms of policing the police, supervision and understandings of power, again, give me a bit more what exactly you're...
Again, this is a thought I'm just working out, so it's very inchoate. But the idea, you know, if you are talking of Indian policemen as violence workers, and of them, of their unworlding and of their enacting sovereign violence on others, you know, their subjectivity is not the discipline and punish kind of subjectivity where they are being watched all the time and therefore are trained to behave in a certain way, right? This is a very, it's the older form of hierarchical supervision that never really can function the way it's meant to. You cannot always be supervised, as you say, which means that you are not building disciplined subjects of the panoptic sort, but the unworlding instead is unleashing a sort of violence on others. I mean, this is very, I'm just thinking out, but it was, I was just curious about what a culture of supervision means to the forming of violence workers as subjects vis-a-vis a panoptic culture.
So one of the things I mentioned in the book is that the colonial state had to tread an incredibly fine line with its violence workers, right? So on the one hand, they need to be rendered sovereign. They need to be given the power to enact violence on behalf of the colonial state. But on the other hand, that has to be very finely calibrated, right? Because then that runs the risk of threatening the state. And so that's one of the reasons in the book I look at all the ways the police were disciplined. And it's insane if you see the figures, right? I mean, looking just at the statistics for Bengal in any one year, about half of the police are gotten rid of, right? And these are what, you know, all colonial officials, anybody who had anything to do with the police would say were the dregs. These were the ones that you could, the few that you could get to fill these posts at the ridiculous, you know, wages and so on that they were expected to work. So they were incredibly harshly disciplined in the first half of the 19th century, in fact, physically as well. They could be physically punished. So this is one of the ways in which they were victims, as I've said, of this regime that they're serving. So no, they couldn't be trusted to be self-disciplined, right? They couldn't be trusted to enact that sovereignty on behalf of the state. They had to be constantly reined in. So it's almost like this constant leash letting out of string and pulling back, right? And this is it's almost like paranoia on behalf of the colonial regime. You can see this, and that's, to me, one of the reasons why these endless commissions and non-stop examination of how this system is working. Oh, it's violent, it's terrible, but actually not doing anything about it, right? It's everybody knew that this was a major problem, right? We know this is a problem, we're reliant on it, but that's the problem. And so it heightened, I think, that colonial paranoia and fear. And then there's always that fear, and you can trace this in all sorts of different ways, right? You don't have police regulate things to do with contagious diseases, for example, because they'll go and exploit the women working as sex workers and this kind of thing. All the ways that police power gets reined in and then but is let out again. So I don't think they ever develop in that sense, and they're not expected to as self-disciplined, and that's not the role of them. Yeah, they're more like, you know, some sort of animal that you train, like some sort of agent on behalf of that just needs to be trained enough to do this job, and then if it dares overstep that, then let go. And even to the point, I know in famines, you just let them all go, like it doesn't matter what happens to them. So I hope that answers your question. And then the last one to do with Mayur's. Yeah, this is a big question, Mayur. And I think about the exception, I think one of the issues this comes back to, and this is a difference then between the period you're working on and the period I'm working on, is what was the nature of the colonial state, right? And how do we talk about the colonial state? So for me, there's another fine line I'm trying to walk in this book, which is what aspects of what I'm talking about are particular to the colonial, right? Because yes, a lot of what we're talking about in terms of the exception is not. A lot of what we're talking about to do with police violence is not, right? So to me, I think we need that conception of the exception in order to make sense of the colonial, right? Because otherwise then we're just reduced to the modern state. And there is a particular configuration of the colonial state that isn't a modern state, right? I mean, we could trace it to other states which are hierarchically, racially organized and so on, in which these systems operate very similarly, right? I think it's the extent and the pervasiveness, and that the entire state is dependent. So my point is, there is no colonial state without this system, right? So I don't know. I mean, yeah, we could talk about that a long time, and I don't think in the book I do that. I don't sort of say this is the colonial state versus these other states, and that is a huge question. But I think it's one that definitely merits thinking. To me, the first thing was, okay, can I lay out the nature of this state, and then that's it. That's a basis to start thinking about these concepts more broadly. Because I just didn't feel anywhere I'd read that I really got a sense of how this thing worked and how violence sustained it, right? Because again, as I mentioned in the book, when we look at violence, it's always these so-called exceptional, these big events, but not how does the violation of colonized bodies on a daily basis enable this regime to exist? And so for me, in doing that, I feel I still need that conception. Also because, as I do make a point in the book, I talk a lot about conceptions to do with bare life, and I temper Agamben's work in ways that I think, you know, he misses Foucault's arguments, or it doesn't sufficiently take them into account, particularly on that idea of, okay, you've got a space of exception, but that doesn't tell you anything about how violence happens, right? Violence isn't inherent in that space, and it doesn't tell you the form that takes or who's doing it or any of those things. And so that's, to me, what I want. What does the configuration of the exception in this particular way, how does that make certain forms of violence possible? And then what forms of violence are possible? Yeah, so that's, but I could easily see then coming outwards from that and thinking far more broadly. And I could easily see that the point you make about, yeah, so what is norm and exception then, right? If the sorts of, if the law itself is at the root of exception, of what we would consider exceptional violence, right? Law-making violence, law-preserving violence, then yeah, I think absolutely, then that raises a lot of questions. Oh, but one of the things, sorry, that I mentioned is that one of the things I tried to point out in the book is that notion of exception as Agamben uses it is productive, but I'm not arguing that all Indians were rendered homosassa, right? That, so again, that's where the ideas and these two different notions of exceptionality come in. If you were an educated Parsi in Bombay, this is never going to happen to you, right? So, or large swathes of the Indian population are never going to be or see or experience this violence, right? They're removed from, because they're part of that larger operating part of the system. So in that sense as well, I think that concept is still works. Thanks.
Thank you for that very powerful answer. I'm actually thinking as you were speaking that I started with the plan to ask you what a post-police state would look like. So essentially to tell us about your next book, perhaps the one you did not write or were not permitted to write by the publishers. But shall I wait and see if anybody in the audience actually would like to ask a question? I have invited, please do just unmute yourself at this point and ask a question if you should wish to, or put questions in the chat. Let's hang on a bit. Sometimes people are a bit shy. Meanwhile, I'm bursting with questions, so we will certainly fill this period. And I want, right, I'll let people put a question in the chat, and I'll keep an eye on the chat. So if a question pops up, or an indication that people want to ask a question, then I'll stop straight away. I had so many questions for you. It's the kind of book that makes you want to turn to the author and say, tell us about how do we resolve these conundrums of today. But I think you have been doing some of that already. And actually, I wish this was a real seminar and we were actually meeting to have a proper party. I keep coming back to that theme, in which I wish we could have a very like JNU style discussion about where I would assert that this distinction between the colonial and the post-colonial seems to me completely unsustainable. And maybe it's all about those who are able to believe in the rule of law, and that's what the exception really is, this myth that some people can inhabit. But I actually want to push you a little bit in the same way that I did in the LSA roundtable, in connection with normalizing and normativizing on the question of desire, and asked you then, but I want to ask you again for this audience. Is there not actually a kind of performance of violent pornography in the, and that's what I called it at that time, because it seems to me that some of this violence, which you are in fact so parsimonious with showcasing because of the concerns, the very valid ethical concerns you talked about, but the violence that Radha mentions in her book, and the violence you talked about seems to be so gratuitous in its detail, in its viciousness, but also its extreme sexualization, that I found it really hard not to think of something that was dramatized, which had a script which was terribly like a form of pornography. And what's the role of desire in there? And in association with that question, I kept constantly thinking also about the graphic descriptions of vicious gang rapes that we keep being fed by Indian media and others. It all seems to be, which are frequently filmed, by the way, as we know, and that those films circulate as well. Is there something about desire going on here? Because you do actually step back at a certain point. You talk about the awful conditions which pushes peasants to becoming policemen and torturers, right? Which is part of the explanation. But there's something about desire, I think, there as well, or not. I just want to open the question to you.
I mean, it's interesting, you've all alluded to the present. I mean, maybe one reason the book feels so contemporary and that it's speaking to the present is if, Mayur, you read through those 9 million footnotes. Most of my work on policing comes from scholars who work on the contemporary, right? Because there's hardly anything on the colonial period. There's very little on colonial policing period. I mean, rigorous, like critical stuff. And so in trying to make sense of how this system worked at its various levels and the roles of the men within it and their rationales and so on, I very much had to look at contemporary stuff and interpolate backwards. Saying that, where are you going to find desire, right? I mean, in colonial records, I talk in the book about changing notions of pain. So when I historicize torture, and I talk about this wonderful but small strand of scholarship that links the emergence of pornography with anti-colonial humanitarian movements. So humanitarianism and pornography essentially emerging at the same time. And, you know, and there are scholars who've worked on this in relation to slavery, so the anti-slavery literatures and discourses, and most of that stuff's designed for middle-class white women, you know? And so there's definitely operating at some level as, at the very least, obscenity, if not pornography, for these readers, right? Depictions of lacerated black male buttocks, and I mean the fetishization in that literature is and the imagery is astounding, and it's not surprising. So my first book, as you mentioned, Nandini, is on obscenity. I mean, there's not much in the way of pornography from the 18th, 19th centuries that I've not read, particularly to do with the colonial period. Okay, Mayur, thanks. So yeah, this project almost seemed like a natural continuation of that earlier work. There's a great deal that, I mean, what do you make of that one case from 1839 that I talk about, which almost seems like you could see it as a pornographic video on YouTube or something, right? In the way it plays out, in what husband and wife are asked to do. And I read that in the British libraries. I found that particular case in those, you know, East India Company books, so handwritten. These descriptions of being expected, husband and wife being forced to perform oral sex on each other and all this kind of, and I practically fell off my chair because this is 1839, right? And the language that it was described in, but also that very mundane, matter-of-fact tone. Still not entirely knowing what to make of that. What I will say is the fact that sexual violence was ubiquitous in torture, that it cannot be separated from torture, is something I have thought a lot about, and I talk about it in the book. I talk about it elsewhere. It's my next project. Because it merits its attention on its own right. And as I talk about in the book, I can't remember if I do this in the book or elsewhere, but one of the problems with the scholarship on torture, and one of the reasons I talk about that, I mentioned that sexual violence against male bodies litters the colonial archive. It's in there because it's not seen as sexual violence, right? Whereas when it comes to Indian women, and this is something I'm just now getting to interrogate, I have hardly any cases involving sexual violence against Indian women. It's all vivid, visceral descriptions against men. I mean, the proportion I have about women are much smaller. And I don't think that's particularly hard to explain. I said, on the one hand, what's happening against men, and this is true today in all of the scholarship on torture, how torture is handled in international law, that kind of thing. Sexual violence gets simply subsumed as part of that, and it's just torture. And so the meaning of these various acts doesn't get sufficient attention. So for me, the fact that torture took that form is very important, and I give some rationale as to why. But no, I don't. I think it's possible to potentially get into issues to do with desire in this larger project, but it's really hard for me to say that at the moment, simply because what we have on the torture is virtually nothing. And so it's interpolating from, say, if we can trace particular forms of performance, particular modes of violence, you know, and I can actually do that to some extent. So I think it might be possible to talk about that.
That's a great promise. And I think we'll have to be satisfied with that for now. And if we were actually complaining, not complaining really, mock complaining about how hard some of the content of the present book was, just imagine how hard that one is going to be. Maybe you do need to write a book about flowers now. Deana, you've done
Fungi is my thing. I'm a closet and amateur mycologist who's obsessed with fungi, and I keep thinking I got to do something on mushrooms, because you know it's just so. And I'm sure once I do it, I'll find all these. Oh, they're used as psychotic drugs, and I'll get, you know, it'll all turn ugly really quickly.
One is really dragged in a certain direction. Here I was thinking of magic mushrooms and parties, which seems to be my theme of the day. But perhaps it now, having gone 6:30, it's a good time to just do a round of applause for your excellent scholarship and the huge worlds that it has actually opened up for us. Also thanks to Radha and Mayur, who's just left, and to Susan and the Perpetrator Studies Network for such a lively conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.